Keith, take it away.
Thank you, John. Thanks to you and Linda. We are always happy to participate in these events. So good morning, good evening to everybody joining us. I think we have participated in all but maybe one of these virtual conferences. So we have to mix things up because we're a recurring voice at these events. And what I'm really excited to share today is some work that my colleague Sandy Scroven really drove inside of Profitero to help sort of pierce some of the noise and hype and confusion in what we believe, and it appears many of our friends in the industry believe, is a complex and fragmented ecosystem of technologies and partners. So what we're here to talk about today at a high level is a framework for thinking about capabilities in the specific area of e-commerce, but we think some of this thinking would translate to any domain. A little bit about how to think about your budget for capabilities, how to manage 8 work streams that we've identified as essential to outperformance in e-commerce. There may be others, but there are at least 8 that we've identified as we look at our clients in the market. And then finally, how do you identify, select, and deploy partners and technologies to maximize their value? And just to share a bit about how we arrived at some of these perspectives, naturally, as a solution provider, we have a lot of direct experience participating in some of these processes. But secondly, we surveyed a few hundred companies globally about how they're organizing and budgeting for e-commerce, and a few of the questions we asked related specifically to this topic. We also have done what I think of as desk research to take a look at really 2 big topics. One, how are CPG companies investing in accelerators, incubators, and do they have corporate venture arms or brand accelerators? And then secondly, we identified more than 200 companies with a solution or a technology or an offering in these 8 areas. So in addition to what I'll be walking you through today, there is an extended, almost 40-page guide that details all of these 8 areas that I'm going to step you through and identifies those 200-plus companies in the broader ecosystem. In fact, some of the companies that you'll see in that guide are presenting today. So you'll see a few familiar faces if you stick around for the full virtual conference. So if we can take just a minute, RFPs, if you're unfamiliar, are requests for proposals, and I just wanted to get a quick pulse check before we dive in, to see, for those on the line, how do you feel about them? So we'll only keep the polls open for another few minutes, a little less than the polling from last week, and I'm already seeing a pattern. We'll jump to the results. I'm surprised. I was assuming we would have an overwhelming majority that are not a fan. I'm surprised to see some folks that love them or like them. I will concede I'm in the minority. I love RFPs, but most people generally think they're not the optimal way of making decisions. So it's a little bit of light humor to start the discussion, but we don't find many companies that love RFPs, and yet everybody finds themselves doing them. So hopefully what we can cover in this discussion are some ideas for how to move as quickly as you need to keep up with this fast evolving landscape. So let's dive in. This is a framework that I previewed a minute ago when I said we've identified these 8 work streams. And we think it's really essential to anchor yourself in the work that needs to be done, the jobs that need to be done, and then think about who will do the work, whether it's an internal dedicated team, maybe somebody's part-time role internally, or maybe outside help at an agency, a consultancy, a brokerage, or a technology partner. And working backwards from the work and who does the work, identifying the right tools, and then deploying and driving adoption and usage of those tools. And it sounds really obvious and intuitive, but when you actually step back and look at how many companies identify, select, and deploy technologies, it starts with the technology. Frankly, they will get inbound interest from a salesperson or a business development person with an interesting story about this new and shiny technology, and then the next 6 or 12 months are spent looking for an application of that exciting new technology. All this simply suggests is start with the work and then find the tools that help the people doing that work be more effective and efficient. And so to read this chart, you would start from the bottom and the left and work upwards. It's a vastly simplified maturity model that simply starts with the basic blocking and tackling of account management, that is supporting your online retailers and omni-channel retailers, and then progresses to more sophisticated and more resource-intensive work streams that can help position you for strategic advantage and outperformance, but may not be where you start out of the gate. So just to share some of the results of the survey that I mentioned, we fielded this survey with our friends at Kantar Consulting, and as I said, we had hundreds of global manufacturers respond. And what we've done here is bucket the responses into 3 cohorts based on the percentage of those brands' total sales that are online, just so that you can get a sense for, at different levels of channel commitment or involvement, what does the high-level spending look like? And what you see, irrespective of what percentage of a brand sales are spent or are represented online, several of these categories are clearly getting heavy investment. Data and analytics services, PIM and DAM, which stands for Product Information Management and Digital Asset Management. Very, very fundamental, as you'll hear, to how you keep your product information and content organized. And then finally, I'd say consultants and agencies broadly, but especially at the end of the landscape that is doing proportionately less volume online, maybe earlier on the maturity curve, just getting started. You can clearly see with those orange bars, there's a lot of investment in outside help. So this is just some fresh data from our recent survey that may be helpful for benchmarking some of the broad areas that brands are investing in, and it all aligns with the work that we're going to describe now. So first things first, let's talk about getting the channel basics right. This work stream we describe as account management, and I think any brand on the line certainly has a selling organization that's oriented around their retail accounts. And so as e-commerce continues to grow and mature, in some cases, this work is all about dedicating somebody to a predominantly online retailer like Amazon, or it may be about supporting the digital or e-commerce activities at an omni-channel retailer like Walmart, Kroger, and Target. And so whether it's a single person's role or, as many of you probably have in your organization, an entire team dedicated to that account management, it's really about sort of end-to-end making sure that the retailer gets all of the basic inputs they need to distribute and sell your products. And the primary roles that tend to be involved are literally called account managers or channel managers, but you'll often find category management and many of the other functions, if not dedicated to the work, designated and looped in. In this area, the main technology or tool that we highlighted is what we call vendor portals or direct data. And that would be something like Retail Link, or in Amazon's context, Vendor Central and Amazon Retail Analytics. In some cases, you'll be able to get those data sets at no cost. It's just part of the way that some retailers trade and do business with their suppliers. In other cases, there may be tiers, paid premium versions of an analytics suite or another program. And our mission today is not to tell you which ones are worth the money or not, but it is important to, at a minimum, familiarize yourself with what tools the retailer you're supporting offers directly, and really start there. So the next topic is related to product content, which we think of as packaging at the digital shelf. In other words, your product content, of course, should reflect everything that the physical package displays. So a lot of trademark and brand equity and creative, but all the fundamental details like size, nutrition information, ingredients, whatever's on the package. But the elegance of e-commerce is a product detail page can contain much more information and richer interactive media like video or 360-degree images. And so in addition to some of the interesting things you can add that transcend physical packaging, there's a lot of complexity because different retailers are at different levels of sophistication with their own online commerce platforms. They may, for example, not accommodate video, or they may have different character constraints or limits than your other retailers. And there are many different ways that retailers seek content from their suppliers. The good news is it's getting rarer and rarer for retailers to ask suppliers to upload a spreadsheet that's manually populated with information from wherever somebody can find it. But if you can believe it, there are some that still operate that way. There are others that are either agnostic about content syndication systems, or some retailers are even essentially credentialing or recommending some of the options. But the key is, if you are committed to doing business in the online channel, you're going to have to centrally manage your content, and you're going to have to distribute or syndicate it to retailers. And a lot can go wrong, unfortunately, in that process, which is why you will probably also want to be monitoring content for integrity and compliance with whatever style guides or expectations you've developed internally. So what you really see in the bullets here is a life cycle of sorts for your content. And the key tools that plug into that life cycle, we would advocate at the beginning of the life cycle, before you go spend a lot of money on content or tools to reinforce your content, would be some benchmarking into how high the bar has been set in your category, in your competitive set. That is, how many images do you need, and do you really need video or 360-degree images? Do you need the enhanced manufacturer content? Some of those big questions. Because if you're not looking at your specific competitive context, you may overinvest by benchmarking against really broad-based, imprecise points of comparison. Or you might underinvest by not realizing that, in fact, in your category, the outperformers have 7 images, or 80% of the bestsellers have A+ content. Then, of course, you'll create the content, and some companies do that in-house. Some companies work with outside agencies. So you will see in this extended guide that I've referenced a few times, there is an entire section identifying agencies. And in fact, if you'll visit our website in the coming weeks, we're actually going to translate that PDF document into a living directory of agencies that you can review on our website. So stay tuned for that. But there are dedicated agencies that do nothing but product content, and so if that's the kind of help that you need, they may be worth a look. Once you have met these first two sort of basic requirements, that is, you've got a foundational approach to supporting the transactional relationship with a retailer. You'll be in distribution, and you've gotten your fundamentals of product content to a comfortable place. And I'm only spending a couple minutes on it just so everybody knows that can be a year-long, if not multi-year effort if you're trying to overhaul your entire product portfolio's content and you're trying to syndicate it and analyze the impact of it across all your retailers. So it's a journey, and it's a never-ending journey. But assuming that you've made some progress on that front, you now know what good content looks like. You've established some standards and expectations. You're managing it centrally. You're syndicating it efficiently. You're checking to make sure that the right content was distributed, and you're analyzing its impact. Now you really have sort of earned the privilege of broadening how you focus on other drivers of sales. And these are all areas like search and reviews, even more sophisticated approaches to optimizing your product content, and even some of the supply chain basics, like just making sure that you're in stock and available. So this is probably the closest to home for what we at Profitero do. We're an e-commerce performance analytics and automation platform for brands. So this is an area that we can comment on a little more in detail than some of those that we're more at arm's length with. But ultimately, this is all about getting as much visibility into what really moves the needle performance-wise in the online channel or with a specific retailer, so that you can really be efficient about how you spend your time and resources. Because the commonality in every company I think we've ever worked with or spoken to, whether they're big or small or have a 200-person e-commerce team or one person, none of them have enough time, people, or money to do everything that they could do. And so this is really about beginning to define and deploy a framework for prioritizing what do we need to invest time and money on to actually move the needle. When you look at where the headcount is accruing or growing fastest, again, I mentioned we surveyed a few hundred brands globally, and we asked not only who do you have now and who have you hired, but looking ahead, what are the roles that you are investing in? And when you look at these first three roles, I think it reflects why we started with these first three work streams. You'll see account management and sales is the number 2 role that companies are planning to hire. Content and digital merchandising is a role that commonly, literally focuses on product content to make sure that the right content is displayed the right ways in the right places. And then thirdly, the role that respondents signaled was the highest priority is data analytics and insights, which I think just underscores a few things, but most importantly that data and analytics are a huge source of advantage in retailing broadly, but in e-commerce specifically. I think it also, unfortunately, is a reflection of the broader topic that brings us together today, which is fragmentation and complexity. I think, as you'll hear me go into a little more detail about, many of us thought, oh, e-commerce is all digital. It'll be much more measurable than brick and mortar retail. In many ways, it is. As I'll describe, there are things you can do online at scale and with a degree of precision that is cost prohibitive or impossible to do in brick and mortar. As one example, in the context of a retail environment like Amazon, it's possible to basically track the clickstream and see, which products are getting how much traffic and which products are converting at what rates. That's the kind of thing that we can do in the context of Amazon that you really would struggle to do continuously for all of your products day by day in a brick and mortar environment. So there are respects in which e-commerce is much more measurable, but there are others in which, unfortunately, metrics or KPIs that you would expect to see from a brick and mortar context, you just can't get online. So we think part of the reason companies are hiring so aggressively is it gives them an advantage, and part of it is it's still really hard to piece everything together. Somewhat related to the digital shelf sales drivers that I already highlighted is the whole area around consumer-generated content. So this is all about ratings and reviews, customer questions and answers, and increasingly consumer-generated images, video. That's earlier on the maturity curve, but it is an interesting area. So this is very similar to many of the areas that we already discussed, with the exception that you have a little less direct control over it. But ultimately, what we know from studies that seem to validate every single year, as well as our own data, which we can use to analyze what actually moves the needle in terms of sales and profitability. Shoppers really do trust their peers, whom they perceive not to have a paid agenda in many cases. And so authentic and genuine ratings and reviews are among the most trusted sources of information about brands and products. And that's why, especially in the context of an online retailer like Amazon or Walmart or Jet, it's so important first to make sure that your products have at least one review, and we see a profound increase in conversion rates for any product that goes from 0 reviews to 1 review. And secondly, you want to be sure that you're rated highly enough, and perhaps surprisingly or counterintuitively, being rated at a 5 is not necessarily going to outperform a 4 or 4.5. And the reason, which is supported by academic studies, is if you're too highly rated, people get suspicious that the reviews are fake. And then ultimately, if you're getting negative reviews, building on that last point, negative reviews are important and can be positive, especially if you respond to them. So paying attention to the negative reviews that you get and having a consumer affairs team or customer response team follow up with a concise message that goes something like, "We're really sorry you had that experience. Thank you for the feedback. Here's how we can make things right. Visit our website or contact our 1-800 line," that sort of thing. So there's a fairly well-defined set of work involved in encouraging real shoppers to leave authentic and genuine reviews through things like sampling campaigns to be sure that your products have at least 1 review and ideally have a sufficient number of reviews and are rated highly enough that your products still end up positioned favorably in search results and end up converting at the levels that you need them to. So there are companies that can help you run those sampling campaigns. There are companies that can help you collect and syndicate the reviews from your own brand.com site. Bazaar Voice is a good example of that kind of company. And then there are companies that can help you monitor, measure, respond, and so on, all of whom you'll find in that 40-page guide that I mentioned. Continuing up the maturity curve and still in that second tier focused on optimizing your sales and your growth, I don't think it should come as a surprise to anybody that search and specifically paid search and paid media are an important and quickly growing lever in the overall toolkit for e-commerce, but especially at Amazon, where if you haven't seen the headlines, it's already a mid-single-digit billion-dollar business for Amazon. But given some of Amazon's unique advantages and how aggressively they're investing and experimenting in it, there's speculation it'll be a $100 billion business for Amazon in 5 years. So it is a really critical part of how you maximize your discoverability and your findability at Amazon and any online retailer. And it is viewed most commonly narrowly through the lens of a paid vehicle. We think a more sophisticated way to look at it is holistically combining organic or earned search and paid. But the bottom line is very similar to what we saw when Google and Yahoo and Bing emerged and evolved. Identifying the keywords or the search phrases that you want to target, whether they're branded or general, whether they're your brands or competitive brands, whether they're really frequently searched and a little more broadly applicable, or whether they're less frequently searched but really niche and relevant to your products. Those are all the kinds of questions that the individuals and teams or agencies managing this are dealing with. What should we bid? How much should we budget? What's a good return on ad spend? Well, the answers really depend a lot on what your objectives are in the competitive context. But this is very quickly becoming a huge component of what drives your performance in these channels. Many of the retailers that don't already have their own paid search or paid media capability are quickly either developing or partnering with the kind of companies that can accelerate that capability. So it is really, really quickly growing. And when you look at who does the work, it's one of the most fascinating areas to me at the moment because it's fuzzy. There is no clean-cut answer when we look across companies that we've studied. You have traditional brand or marketing teams that would have managed Google budgets that view AMS, as it was formerly known, Amazon Advertising as it's called now, as something that they are not necessarily familiar with, but they manage paid search on Google. Why wouldn't they manage it in the context of Amazon? But you also have Amazon teams that manage every other facet of doing business with Amazon and say, why would we carve that narrow sliver up and hand it to a team that doesn't have the same holistic understanding of Amazon, while they may be really expert in Google type SEO and SEM? And then finally, as you saw on the slide covering the survey response data, in many companies it's been fully outsourced to agencies, both because the learning curve can be a little steep and the agencies have that knowledge and know-how in-house, and because it remains a pretty labor-intensive work stream to manage, and many companies have a cost structure that supports outsourcing versus insourcing. But there are all kinds of tools in this area, some of which are available directly from the retailers, some of which are third-party tools that are sort of layered on top of the retailer direct tools. And then, of course, there are many agencies that can help accelerate your performance and know-how in this area. But it is one of the fastest growing and most critical areas that we see. This next one is what we call distributed commerce. I've seen it called commerce anywhere, commerce everywhere. I just want to be clear about what we're really describing here, but it is essentially a type of technology that will allow shoppers to transact almost anywhere they encounter a product digitally and in some cases physically. But some of the most common executions of this concept are things like buy now, or where to buy, or add to cart, or shoppable recipe platforms. So just to take shoppable recipes as an example, if you visit All Recipes or some of the other really popular recipe sites or meal planning inspiration sites, they will come with a list of general ingredients. But there are technologies that you as a brand manufacturer or even as a retailer can use to essentially make those recipes shoppable, so that instead of simply showing a shopper a generic ingredient like sugar, you can go beyond that to say, here's the sugar that we recommend, and it happens to be in stock for collection or delivery at these local online grocers. So it is essentially oriented to, number one, maximizing the discoverability and the traffic that accrues to your product pages and to your brand, but importantly makes those touch points transactable, so that some of the friction involved in converting oneself from a shopper to a buyer is eliminated. You know, if I'm inspired by a recipe page, or I'm on your brand.com site and I'm learning a lot about why you're different and better than the other products, even if you don't have a direct-to-consumer e-commerce site, you're likely to be in distribution at other online retailers. So a where-to-buy capability would simply show a shopper on your own brand.com, as an example, where they could buy that product locally or even nationally. It's ultimately just about embedding the option to add to a cart or buy in some of the most common touch points that a shopper would encounter a product. So you'll in that section of the guide, you'll see companies like Constant Commerce and Whisk and Channel Advisor and Channel Site. Those are just a few that we've encountered, but it's a really interesting space. And now we're getting into a little bit of what I think is rarefied air, and everything that I've covered so far I would characterize as demand chain activities. And all demand chain means is what are we as suppliers doing to create and capture demand. It's all about growth and a disproportionate focus on the top line as opposed to the bottom line. But as you look at where we are as an industry, especially in the CPG industry as it relates to online grocery and e-commerce, my view is we're at an inflection point where the volume is now substantial enough and the share of overall sales that e-commerce represents large enough that as an industry, both retailers and suppliers have to take a more balanced approach to growth and profitability, so that we've got sustainable economics for this collection of business models. And as we look over the next 5 or 10 years, we're actually making money. And what that leads companies to is a focus on the supply chain. So not just how are we going to grow and maximize incrementality and gain share of our category or get greater than our fair share, but how do we make sure that we're sustaining our average selling prices? How do we minimize the cost of shipping, handling, packaging, and so on? And that leads many companies to a couple areas. I mean, a basic focus on collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, sort of mirroring what many companies do in a brick-and-mortar retail relationship, is where many companies are starting in the e-commerce landscape. But we see some of the more committed and sophisticated companies actually beginning the R&D and new product development process with the end in mind. That is, we want to design something under the assumption that this product will be sold on Amazon, and that it will be, and that more of it will be sold on Amazon or online over the coming years. And that means thinking deeply about, at a minimum, price pack architecture, if not rethinking the product form or the packaging. And one of the most common examples I've used over the years is what we saw in the laundry category, where, if you go back a decade, most households would have a 1-gallon jug of liquid detergent sitting somewhere in their mudroom or on their washing machine. But when you think about an e-commerce model, especially a direct doorstep delivery model, that gallon is prone to leakage. It's heavy, and if it costs $7 to ship that SKU in 2 days or less, but we can only charge $9, you can start to see some of the pressure on the unit economics that might suggest. So some of the more forward-looking suppliers started experimenting with things like powdered unit doses or liquid unit doses that not only were less prone to leakage and were more concentrated and therefore were lighter weight, but had a perceived convenience factor that actually allowed them to charge more on a unit basis. So suddenly you had a product that was actually at a premium on a unit basis, but also had a form factor and packaging that had lower packaging costs and handling costs for e-commerce. And now, just this week, there's another headline that Procter & Gamble has launched a new item or line of detergents that, again, is sort of optimized for a direct doorstep delivery future. So it is really about, if you can support it, thinking with the end in mind about how and where people are going to be buying your products and designing the form factor or the packaging to suit. Or it may be, as a step on that path, just looking at price pack architecture and making sure that the right products in the right configuration are distributed in the right places. And there are agencies and testing labs and consultancies that you'll find in the extended guide that can help in all those areas. And so now, here we are in the sort of third tier on our very simple maturity model. So we're nearing the end. And what we included at that rarefied upper echelon is this emerging strategy of either corporate venture capital, brand accelerators, or technology accelerators that are either fully owned by a brand manufacturer or are sometimes done in partnership with an outside player like Techstars, just to use one example. And so we looked at this area because the big question that we are always trying to study is what separates the winners from the others, or the outperformers. And one of our observations over the last 5 years, but especially over the last 2 years, is that the winners on Amazon specifically, but e-commerce broadly, tend to be emerging brands. That is, new brands, often born in the last several years, sort of the last 5 years, targeting digital natives, but ultimately, because they're new, they don't have a lot of legacy to maintain or defend. They are fully on offense. They're working backwards from the future. They're not trying to make small incremental improvements on their 100-year legacy. So what you start to see when you look at CPG companies globally in the kinds of investments they're making, you do see somewhere between 10 and 20% of the industry with one of these models already deployed. And corporate venture capital has a mixed reputation, but it is growing in popularity, not because, in my view, a company expects a 10x or a 20x return on those investments, but it's a way to learn and perhaps get advantage through the equity investment in a technology partner. Brand accelerators are really about offering some of the freedom and flexibility that a new brand or a new company would enjoy, but giving them access to some of the resources and tools that a large-scale incumbent leading manufacturer enjoys. And the same is sort of true on the technology side. They may not be investing from an equity perspective in a technology, but they are lending their expertise and perhaps some service fees to help influence the development of a capability like some of those that we've described. So that's not any specific technology, but it's an enabling competency or capability that we think is important in this channel. Okay, so just to bring the discussion to a bit of a conclusion and share some of what we've learned through our direct work in this big research that we did. Some of the big questions that you will grapple with if you are selecting any partner or technology, questions to be thinking about and answering as you go through those exercises. The first is, I think, build versus buy. And I know it's the second bullet, but that is one of the key questions before you get into any of the details. You may conclude that a certain technology or competency is so important that you want to build it and fully own and manage it. And that can be a really compelling thing to do if, number one, you think it is likely to yield strategic advantage over the long term. Anything that you think is going to yield advantage, you're probably going to want to, if not own entirely, at least have some degree of exclusivity around or customization around. But you also have to have the competencies to do it. And the reason many companies, and Andrew Freeman, who you'll hear from later today, is biased towards buying or renting, part of the reason is, what you do as a company is typically make products. And if you're trying to build a world-class solution in a given area, odds are good there's a company that does nothing but build that solution. And so you'll probably save time, grief, likely money, and get a better outcome in many cases if you just identify and work with the best. But that sort of leads you to the second big question, which is all-in-one or best of breed. And I hope that's a relatively intuitive concept, but what you will see, as we see when we look at this ecosystem of 200 plus companies, is some of them are really companies. Some of them, one might argue, are features that are masquerading as companies. But they may have features that nobody else has, or they may be doing something really notable and interesting and important. And that's going to set up questions for you around, well, we already work with this one or that one or these three or four. Are we really ready to layer in a fifth or a sixth? And the answer can be absolutely, if you've got the bandwidth. It can be a great way to keep learning and making sure that you're not missing what's on the bleeding edge. On the other hand, as the number of vendors that you are working with grows, there are some serious costs, not only due to the inefficiency and diseconomies of working with a lot of vendors, but you got to learn a bunch of different interfaces. The tools and systems may not integrate or be harmonized or work together. And so, there are diseconomies as well. So there's an even more detailed discussion of how to evaluate some of those decisions in the guide, but I wanted to highlight that one. Insourcing or outsourcing, as we've said, it's very closely related to the build versus buy or rent. It's really just oriented to the agency discussion. We think agencies play an essential role in the industry. We've got a whole agency program with some great agency partners, and we see and they see, agencies can do great work on clients' behalf in ways that are hard or impossible to match in-house. But as time goes on and you get more mature, you may find there are rationales to bring some of the work, especially work that you think is going to be strategic, in-house. And so the key is, whichever you decide to do at a point in time, be sure that you set clear expectations for that partner and are pushing them. And secondly, that you're learning as much from them as you go, so that if you do eventually decide to bring it in-house, you can handle it. And then on the global versus local, I only want to spend a second on that, but many of the companies that we work with, some of the companies I see on the line, are companies that have big international footprints. And for all of the reasons that an all-in-one solution makes sense in a country context, there's a desire in many global companies to standardize internationally too. But that can be a source of confusion or tension, because on a country level or a regional level, there's nuance. And some of what works in the headquarters market might translate and some of it might not. So when you're getting into these kinds of exercises, it can be really important to anticipate, hey, is this a capability that we may want to extend or roll out to other countries or other business units, and look at some of the trade-offs between what's really ideal for one region or business unit and what would be good enough but would also suit a broader set of stakeholders in the business. So I'm just going to wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. I'm not going to read each of the bullets on how do you find potential tools and partners, but I would suggest, if you haven't already seen it, visit our website, profitero.com. This deck will actually send you right to the landing page for the digital toolkit piece. But if you want to see who's out there in each of these areas, at least who we've discovered, you can see it in that asset. And if there are companies that we missed, we want to know. In other words, everything that we published was true as of the day we published it, and it was everything that we know, but we don't know it all. And we're really dependent on the feedback that we've already been getting about, hey, you missed this one, or have you thought about this? So please do read it and let us know what we missed. And here, again, I'm just looking at the clock. This is more data that I hope will be helpful for benchmarking. If you're looking at your 2019 plan and trying to get a sense for where are my peers spending on agencies for what work and what sort of priority, this should be helpful on that front. And then, just to conclude, questions to ask during the selection process. Again, I'm not going to read these, but what I would add to what you can see on the slide is this is a very fast-changing landscape. And I don't mean just the agencies and solution providers that are bombarding everybody with emails and phone calls. I mean e-commerce, the retailers and the other ecosystem players like Instacart and Shipt and so on that in some ways look like retailers, but in other ways are not. Google, it's all moving quickly. And so you should absolutely do the feature comparison every time you're considering making an investment like this. But you should also be, I would advocate, thinking about how sort of stress tested and flexible or agile a potential partner is, depending on what you're partnering with them for, because things change. It's a volatile sort of Wild West environment that is week by week getting a little more stable, a little more standardized, a little easier to operate within. But you do want to be mindful of how quickly things change. And so that means looking at things like what capabilities or technologies are in-house at the potential partner, and what's their financial position and corporate structure, and what incentives does that create for some of the decisions and investments that they're going to make, and how much effort from my team is going to be involved in actually producing value from this, because that's a hidden cost that a lot of companies miss. Certainly there's an invoice that you're going to receive, and AP will have to cut a check, but don't overlook what you might be investing in terms of your team's time and effort and potentially headaches. So I will defer to John and Linda on the topic of whether we've got time for Q&A, because we know that there are a couple different profiles of folks on the line. Anybody that found any of this interesting, I would encourage you to just Google Profitero Digital Toolkit, or you can follow this condensed hyperlink and go download that piece. I think if you're a retailer, a brand, a solution provider, or anybody, it should be an interesting read. If you're a brand, in addition to that, we do offer a free trial of our e-commerce analytics. That's no cost, no commitment, and it might be an interesting way to get to know us a little better. And then finally, if you're an agency that does work in these areas on behalf of manufacturers, I mentioned that program, and we'd love to help you get to know how we work successfully with agencies in many of these areas. So I will also thank Nicholas, who in the chat said, love the podcast, and wants to see more of it. We'll have another couple episodes coming up very soon. So thanks for that feedback. But now, John, I'll leave it to you to see whether we do have time for any questions.
We have time for a question, Keith, one that came in earlier. How should we think about insourcing versus outsourcing?
Yep. I think it is a really important question. I would say the context that you're operating in matters a lot, and the two factors that really matter are how sophisticated are you, and there's a lot of ways to define that, but just ask yourself, do you feel like you understand everything and are executing well, or are you acknowledging you're just getting started? And then secondly, what kind of resources do you have? And if your expertise levels are low and your resources are low, then you absolutely are going to want to find an outside partner who can accelerate both your performance and your learning curve. And then as time goes on, you have to revisit periodically whether you've learned enough or have the internal capacity to bring some of that work in-house. And I would suggest only bringing it in-house, again, if you think it's likely to yield sustainable strategic advantage. And that is, you want to be able to do something or do it in a way that your competitors can't do. That would be the rationale, in our view, for bringing it in-house. And what you may find is, in some areas, it's not a binary, bring it all in-house and outsource nothing. A lot of partners and platforms will give you some freedom and flexibility within a framework. So you may be renting the same platform that a lot of others have, but you can layer on a lot of your own value, or you can provide inputs that will make your experience very different than your peers. That's sort of how we think about what we do, just as an example. We have a platform that has all kinds of standard data and analytics, but when you look at what any individual customer of ours actually receives, it's pretty tailored.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Further questions can be directed to Keith and or Sandy. Their contact information is on the screen. Again, thank you, Keith. That was excellent.
Thank you all. Good to be with you.